I'm going to look one more time. Yeah, I'm on. Stories shape us. Stories shape us. I've said it before, I'll say it again. When we're all walking around, what we are is walking stories. That's who we are. We're walking stories. They infuse our lives. They are our lives. The stories we tell each other shape our understanding. Every culture, every nation has stories that are at the root of their understanding of their place in the world or their purpose. I'm sorry, I just paused because I've been writing my sermon into a phone this week, and there's a typo, and I don't have a clue what it means. Got it. In North America, today some of the root stories are being challenged, while others are being shaped and accentuated in ways that are damaging. And is so often the case, the stories being clung to in these days either serve the majority population, or worse, a very small group within the majority population. As a people of faith, we are a people of story. And so we need to pay attention to the stories that are shaping our culture and our nation right now. Joshua 24, in many ways, is this kind of story. It's a story of the covenant. It's a reiteration and an affirmation of the bond between God and Israel and the Hebrew people. And it seemed a bit long for us, that passage, but it's important. As Sharon read, the first half of that passage is Joshua outlining all the things that God had done for the Hebrew people. They've reached the promised land. They've set up their homes and their land, and they're eating olive oil and honey and all this kind of stuff. Joshua, of course, was the great warrior who, after Moses died, Moses didn't reach the promised land. Joshua brought them across the river, and you remember the stories of Jericho, the walls of Jericho falling as Joshua blew his horn and all this kind of stuff. Battles. The book of Joshua is just a book of battles as the people moved into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Perizzites, the Hittites. Thank you, Sharon. You made it through the list well. They moved into their land. God delivered them to that land, so Joshua says. It is a story of a people and the story of their culture and a story of belonging, but also a story of entitlement, and I have to say, a story of colonization. It has that beautiful phrase in it. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Who has that in their house? On a doily or a pillow or on the wall? Yeah, don't be shy. I'm not going to condemn it. It's like he sounds pretty fired up. How many of you have, as for me and my household, I will serve the Lord somewhere in your house, or have had it? We almost had it printed on our wall in the vinyl, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua 24. Most of us don't know what happened before or after Joshua said that. In the context of this story, Joshua is at the end of his life. Actually, if Sharon had read 2 more verses, it would have said, and then Joshua drew his last breath and died. This was his last speech to the people of God, the Israelites. They've come out of the wilderness. They're in a new land, the land flowing with milk and honey. And Joshua, just before he dies, in his final speech, wants to remind them of the God that did all this for them. And then he asks and summons them to obedience. And he says, which God will you serve? And they say, echoing his words, therefore we will also serve the Lord, for he is our God. And they say it makes sense and a bunch of other things. And Joshua, I love it, argues with them. It's not good enough. Imagine if I came and said to you, hey, who are you going to serve? You say, well, we're going to serve God. I'm like, you sure you want to serve God? I don't know, it's pretty tough. Imagine if the minister said that, right? It is tough. And Joshua wanted to remind them, this is a God that's jealous, a God who gets angry, a God who's tough to follow. So you got to put away all those other graven images, all those other gods. Remember the golden calf, Joshua says? It's in between the lines. Remember that incident? And they hung their heads. And they said, oh, we'll choose this God. Well, I don't know, Joshua says. It's going to be tough. Obedience is tough. And they said, we will choose. And then there's this beautiful line, stuck right out for me. He says, they put this rock. He says, this rock has heard this today and will testify against you if you don't follow the Lord. Now that you've said yes. This stone will speak and testify against you, because it's heard as if the walls could hear, right? The stone has heard. I love that. In the recitation of God's faithfulness, we hear this recounting of God's marvelous deeds, including, harshly, the destruction of many people and the taking of their lands. You know me, I love the Girgashites. Some of you have been kicking around long enough with me to know. The word Girgashite always sticks right out. Oh, the poor Girgashites. You know? In come the Israelites, out go the Girgashites, the Hittites, the Perizzites. They're all Canaanites. They're all descendants of Noah and his grandson, Canaan. They're the same people. Some of them have been in Egypt for a whole bunch of generations and have returned. They're cousins. Move aside, Girgashites. Here come the Israelites, the people of God, apparently. In my mind, the key question of this passage is, will you serve God? That's what Joshua is asking. But more than that, underneath it all is the question, which God will you serve? He says, put away your graven images and all those other gods, the gods of the wilderness, if you're going to choose this one God. Which God will you serve, Joshua says, and it's the question that rings thousands of years later to us. Which God will you serve? Joshua is looking for commitment to God. But I would say we should struggle with commitment to a God who destroys others for our benefit. Zionism is based on this story. Do you know what Zionism is? It's the belief that Jerusalem belongs to the Jewish people. Mount Zion, which Jerusalem is built on, is the homeland of the Jewish people and belongs to them, and no one else should live there. And all of the all of that land should belong to the descendants of the Israelite people. That's Zionism in its worst form. It causes wars and conflicts like raging today. In its lighter form, it's a type of entitlement that still is dangerous. It's very hard to speak against the story of salvation that's there in Joshua. It's hard to have criticism of it because, of course, it is the fundamental story of salvation of the Hebrew people. It is the foundational story of their faith life, the Exodus, coming out of Egypt and being given a new land. So I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring that trickiness, that tough part, but there is an issue with a God who destroys other people so that we might have goodness. It's very much reminiscent of the doctrine of discovery. You ever heard of that? In the late mid-1400s in Europe, the Pope, or the popes, I can't remember how many there were at the time in the mid-1400s, the Pope and the churches and the kings and queens of Spain and Portugal and Britain got together. They didn't get together and have a party. They all started bringing out this idea that the new world, that any new world that is outside of Europe, is meant to be discovered and conquered and taken over and grown and have dominion over by the people of Western Europe. It's called the Doctrine of Discovery. The United Nations in 2005, I think, finally turned away from the Doctrine of Discovery. The Catholic Church has been taking a lead on that in some ways. That, in fact, North America, theologically, wasn't meant to be ours. But it's what drove the settlement. It's what drove colonization all over the world, including the shores of New England and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, way down into Central America. The doctrine of discovery is based on that same kind of story. I was thinking about potlatches. Any of you ever been to a West Coast potlatch before? Like a real potlatch ceremony? Kathy? Yeah, right on. Well, that means Bill. Bill's like, oh, if Kathy was there, I was there. I've been to a potlatch up in Helsik People in the Great Bear Rainforest. The potlatch is a great example of things that went wrong because of the doctrine of discovery. A potlatch is a great ceremony, usually held by a chief, by the head of a household, by the head of a nation, to give away all their belongings. In fact, I read yesterday, they gave away all their belongings and burned some stuff as well, usually copper. They'd burn as a showing, a symbol of abundance and a symbol of wealth, and it gave the chieftain, the chiefs, a great status. But it was also used to celebrate the birth of a child, or to a wedding ceremony, or, as happens often now, a potlatch comes a year after a death to celebrate the purchasing of a headstone and a celebration of a person's life who's been lost. But it was used up and down the West Coast as an economy of power and authority, but also as a way of sharing wealth. So the power and authority wasn't, we're coming and taking your wealth. It was, come to our place and we'll give you all of our wealth. Well, you know what happened. They were made illegal in 1884. They were made illegal by the Canadian government in the Indian Act. Right? You know why? Because the Christian missionaries thought it was so backward. In fact, the quote was, I got it here somewhere. Seen as more than useless, the missionaries said. The potlatch is seen as more than useless because it ran directly against the civilized practice of the accumulation of wealth. How can these people be giving away so much stuff? And I've sat there, I've been in a potlatch and watched, it's like a Kmart has been tipped upside down in the center of a hockey rink. Towels and laundry baskets and 20-pound bags of rice and pots and pans, and then every kid who's dances is given a $50 bill by the elder as they go by as a thank you. And money is handed out to certain family members. And it's just extraordinary to watch what is given away. One of the little traditions is then you take your potlatch stuff and you store it away so that you build up for your potlatch when it's time. So I have friends with whole linen cupboards filled with towels from potlatches, getting ready for when they have a big feast themselves and need to give stuff away. It's just wonderful. But it's backward, hey? 1884. That's that's so against what Jesus would want. Giving away wealth, giving away stuff. That's the doctrine of discovery. Jesus doesn't want any of that kind of stuff. That's weird. God wants us to collect wealth and hold it to ourselves. Not give it away and burn it. Holy moly, burn it. Until 1951, the RCMP would go into the West Coast villages and break up potlatches and jail people. Oh, don't forget Manifest Destiny. There's a great story. You know Manifest Destiny in the United States? It's the root story of the American people, started in the mid-1900s, that the belief was that America was meant to be, that it's the new Jerusalem. They ended up with New York City, as Bruce Coburn says. Tried to build a new Jerusalem, ended up in New York. But this belief that the people of Europe are meant to move across America because God promised it to them. It's their manifest destiny. All of these stories are still at play today in our culture. They're profoundly active in deep imagination of the people, especially the majority people, Western European descendants, living here in North America. Do we want to believe in this God? Will we choose this God, the one who chooses some people and not others? The God who would displace these people for us or for you? I can't overstate how these images of destiny and religious belief that God wants something for us. We call it now the gospel of prosperity. If you weren't here at church, you could be home watching the gospel of prosperity on TV. God, if you pray, God will bring you great wealth, they say. God wants you to be successful. If you just pray enough, God will bring good things to you. Oh, that's hooey. You should pray. That's not hooey. But God isn't bringing wealth to some people and not to others. I remember when I lived in South Alberta, the Hutterites would fast for rain. I always imagined what would happen. Would the rain just fall on the Hutterite colonies and ignore the Mormons? Or the very few United Church people who I served who were farming? Like, what would happen? What's the belief there? It's everywhere. And it's in the politics of America and Canada this day. The politics of North America is getting tighter, friends. Tighter. We are choking ourselves on attitudes of entitlement. The white Anglo-Saxon Western European majority is telling itself a story that is not helpful to the way Jesus would have us live. Sadly, some of that story is a story of victimhood. Those people are taking our jobs. Those people, we shouldn't let them in. Those people don't really believe in America the way they should. Those people don't talk our language. Those people, it always starts with those people. Or worse, those people, if we actually entered a negotiation, we'd lose all our land. Right. I hate that. The story of victimhood. Which we can only tell if we actually believed in the first story, is that we deserved something here more than others. Because God willed it. We deserved this land. God wanted us to have power and dominion over others in the world. That somehow we were meant to be God's people for the world. You hear it in phrases like the American way being spread around the world. The most powerful man in the world. I can never understand why the president's called the most powerful man in the world, even the ones I liked. John F. Kennedy, Barack Obama. Most powerful man in the world. You mean he got all the guns? You have a button that could destroy them? Does that make you the most powerful man in the world? That's manifest destiny right there. That's a belief that God believes you should be doing something for the rest of the world. So go out and share it. Everybody needs a Disney World. As people of faith, we need to see this present crisis, and it is a crisis, folks, as a crisis of faith. We have, for too long, chosen the wrong God. The God who speaks English. The one who has white skin. Not every white-skinned person, but the ones that came from a certain amount of countries in Western Europe. That God looks like us. Wants stuff just for us. It's deep inside there. It's deep down in the story of our nation and the story of our people. We have far too long chosen that God. So I ask you this day, which God do you want to choose? Because as for me and my household, we're going to choose the God of compassion, the God of justice, the God of freedom, the God of liberation, the God of sharing, the God of welcoming, the God of hospitality, and it goes on and on. That's the God I'm going to choose. I hope you'll join me. Amen.